Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Mercer and I'm the museum educator for the Town of Windsor Museums. I'm very excited that you are all here to join us on our virtual field trip today. We're going to be exploring the museum to see how different people have influenced the town and its history. So let's go back in time, all the way back to Windsor in the 1870s. All right, we're going to be looking at over 150 years of history. So take a look at this building on the screen for me. What are some observations you can make about it? Well, I noticed that it's one story. It has a greenish roof. It has a door in the middle and two windows on each side. This building is actually one of the oldest buildings left standing in Windsor today. It was originally called the Halfway House, and it was built in the 1870s to serve as a place for people to stop and eat and rest their horses while they were traveling between Greeley and Fort Collins. Have you ever been to either Greeley or Fort Collins? Well, back before there were cars and you had to take a wagon or a stagecoach or a horse or even walk, it could take up to a full day to get between Greeley and Fort Collins. So this halfway house was built as an inn, exactly halfway between the two places for people to stop and rest and eat. And quickly, the town grew up around it. That's why Windsor is here today, because we're exactly halfway between Greeley and Fort Collins. So a couple of years later, about 20 years later, the town looked like this. Now this is a picture of Main Street in Windsor. We're facing west, so the mountains are in the distance, in the back of the photo. Go ahead and take a minute or so and look at this photo. What do you see? How does it look different than Windsor today? Well, I bet you have some great observations. Just a couple of things that I've noticed is that the street is not paved. It's made out of dirt. Now that would get pretty muddy when it rained, right? That'd be pretty gross to walk downtown. A couple of other things I've noticed is that there's no cars in this photo. There's only horses and wagons. And if you look along the side of the street, especially here, you'll notice that there's posts along the side of the road. Those are called hitching posts, and that's where you would hitch your horse up to so that it wouldn't run away while you were inside shopping. So downtown Windsor looks pretty different than it does today, but some of the buildings are still standing that you see in this photo here. Now let's go forward a little bit in time to the 1940s here in Windsor. Wow, it looks pretty different from the last photo. Take a minute to make some observations. What can you see that looks different from the last photo? I bet you have some great observations, but the first thing that I noticed was that the street is paved now. So this car is driving along nicely and there's cars. So there's no more horses on Main Street. People have cars, the hitching posts are gone. We have light posts to give light. And there's a lot of buildings and businesses. So Windsor really has grown up since the building before. We have more businesses, we have more people, and we have more things that are convenient. So how does this happen? How did Windsor grow? Well, let's think a little bit about what a town needs in order to grow. What do you think? What does a town need to go from being small and having a dirt road in the early 1900s to 40 years later having businesses and paved roads? I'm sure you have some great guesses. I think that there's a couple of major things that you need for a town to grow. The first one is people, right? You need more people to be living in a place for a town to grow. And the second one is something called industry. Have you heard the word industry before? What do you think an industry could be? An industry is all of the businesses and all of the factories making different things in a place that are taking raw materials or natural resources and turning them into usable goods. So an example of this would be a raw material like wood. If I went and cut down a tree, I could take the wood from that tree and I could make a house. And maybe I could start a business taking wood and selling it to people to turn into houses. So you're taking things like wood and you're turning it into usable goods for people. So you need people and you need industry in order for a town to grow. You also need things that provide services to people. So that would be like restaurants so people can go out to eat, or a doctor so that people can get medicine, that sort of thing. All those things help a town to grow. Now, what type of industry did Windsor have? Whoa, take a look at this photo. What do you see? I see a person sitting on top of this wagon, and the wagon is full of a vegetable called sugar beets. Do you like to eat sugar? I love sugar. I love cookies and brownies and cakes. And here in Colorado, when you buy sugar, a lot of the time it's made out of sugar beets, which are the vegetables that you see here in this wagon. You can grow these beets in the ground, and then you can take them to a factory and you can process them down into sugar. Now, Windsor is the perfect place to grow sugar beets. Our climate is great for sugar beets. It's nice and sunny. The sugar beets like our soil here, and so sugar beet growing was a major industry here in Windsor. Now, there's a couple of interesting things to note about sugar beets. One is that you can't just plant a sugar beet seed in the ground and visit it 4 months later and expect there to be a perfect sugar beet. Sugar beets take a lot of upkeep. You have to plant them at certain times. You have to thin out the other plants around them at certain times. It takes a lot of work. And then, even when you do grow a sugar beet, you guys can see some pictures of a picture of some sugar beets here on the screen. One sugar beet, so one of these beets that you see here, only makes 3 teaspoons of sugar. Have you ever seen a teaspoon? If you're not sure how big a teaspoon is, go ahead and pause this video, go into your kitchen and see if you can find a teaspoon measuring spoon. It's not a lot of sugar. Now, take a look at this photo. This shows what's called a beet dump. This is where farmers would take their sugar beets and they would put them onto the train to be shipped off to the sugar factory where they would be turned into sugar. How many beets do you think are in this photo? It must be thousands of beets, right? But again, each sugar beet only makes 3 teaspoons of sugar. Now look at this photo. What do you think is going on here? This is actually the inside of the sugar beet factory that was right here in Windsor. So here you see some men in the middle of the photo, and they have been putting sugar into bags all day. And around them, you can see the bags and bags and bags of sugar. How many bags do you think could be in this photo? I think it's thousands of bags. Now imagine each sugar beet does not provide that much sugar. It only provides a very small amount of sugar. And each one of these bags would take hundreds of sugar beets just to make one bag. And there's thousands of bags. Do you think it took a lot of sugar beets to make all the sugar that would be in this bag? Yes, it would have taken a lot. And it would have taken a lot of people in order to harvest the sugar beets and plant them and take care of them so that we could get sugar. But where did all of these people come from here in Windsor? In 1900, only a couple of years before the sugar beet factory was opened, we only had a little over 300 people living here in Windsor. Do you think that 300 people is enough to do all of the work of growing all those sugar beets? Probably not. So we know that people came to Windsor because of something called immigration. Have you heard the word immigration before? Who is an immigrant? An immigrant is a person who leaves their home in one country to make a home in a different country. Now, why do you think that someone would leave their home in one place to move somewhere else? Well, if you've ever had to move before, you know that there's a lot of reasons someone might move. You might move somewhere else so that you can find a better job. There might be better places to work in a different country. There might be better places to live in a different country, or maybe your family lives somewhere else, and so you leave your home to go be near your family. Maybe you're not happy living in a certain place because there's a lot of problems going on there and you want to move somewhere else. So there's a lot of reasons why people left their countries and other places and came here to Windsor. And in these photos, you can see some of the people that we're going to meet on our field trip today. And we're going to use things called primary and secondary sources to learn all about these people who changed Windsor. Now, the word primary is a fun word. You might have heard primary before because you go to a primary school. Primary usually means like the first of something, the beginning, and we use primary sources to discover facts about the past. Primary sources are things like books and newspapers or diaries or photographs that were taken during the time you're talking about. So this photo here on the screen was a picture of Windsor taken in 1904. That's a primary source because it was taken in 1904 and we can use it to show the time it was talking about. But we can also use secondary sources to discover facts about the past. So a book that was written last year in 2019 about Windsor in 1904 would be a secondary source because it was written after 1904. Or like this photograph on the screen, a photograph of Windsor taken today. Same downtown street, but taken today. So it is a secondary source if we're using it to talk about 1904. Even this field trip could be a secondary source. I'm using primary sources, but you're watching this today to learn about the past. All right, so we're going to use primary and secondary sources to explore a little bit about how people changed Windsor. Now go ahead and take a close look at this photo for me. What's going on in this picture? I bet you have some great observations. A couple of things I noticed is that they are farming sugar beets in this photo. You can see them holding some of the plants in their hands. They're bending down like they just picked them up. Now, the other thing I've noticed is that this looks to be like a family who's farming sugar beets together. There's a dad, there's maybe a woman who could be a mom, and then notice this figure over on the right, this shorter figure here, is actually a child. So entire families moved here to Windsor to farm sugar beets. Remember I said that farming sugar beets was really hard, and so the whole family had to pitch in to make sure that they were able to farm enough sugar beets to make the money that they needed. So can you imagine after going to school, having to go out into the fields to help thin and harvest sugar beets? Oh, that would have been really hard, right? But this family is an example of one of the families who were immigrants, and they came here to Windsor to find a place to work. And most of the families who came here to Windsor to help us farm the sugar beets are called Germans from Russia. Can you say Germans from Russia out loud? Germans from Russia. So take a look at this map of the world on my screen. Now look at the big red dot. The big red dot is over part of a country named Russia. And then look at the small red dot. The small red dot shows North America, and it is right over the approximate location of Colorado. So imagine you live at the big red dot and you're leaving Russia, that's a country called Russia, to come all the way to the United States to find a better life. Now, a lot of people did this. They had moved from Germany in the 1700s because they were looking for a better place to work, and they moved to Russia, which promised them that they could work there, they would have money and villages, they wouldn't have to go fight in wars, that sort of thing. And then in the 1800s, Russia changed their minds, and they said, no, all of you Germans, you have to go to wars and you have to learn how to speak Russian, that sort of thing. And so the Germans, who are now living in Russia, were not happy about this, and they decided to move to find a better life in a different country. And that country and that place a lot of the time was Colorado, and especially Windsor, because the sugar beet industry was taking off right as all these people were looking for new places to live. And so it worked out for them to come here and become sugar beet workers and farmers. So once hundreds of families moved here to Windsor, our population exploded. We had so many people. But what happens when a lot of people move to a place? Right, you need new businesses, you need new schools, you need new stores, you need houses, places for people to live. And so Windsor just exploded overnight and got lots of new businesses. Here you'll see a school photo from the 1920s showing some children around Windsor. Here's a general store that was built in Windsor, and then on the bottom right photo is a farmhouse. And a lot of farmhouses that look just like this were built in Windsor in the early 1900s for families of Germans from Russia who were coming here. In fact, if you have ever been to downtown Windsor and you've driven through the neighborhoods around it, you can still see a lot of those exact houses standing today. Maybe you've seen one yourself. So let's go ahead and meet some of the families who moved here in Windsor and learn about how they influenced the town. Now this is the Nazarenus family. This is Henry Nazarenus and his wife. Now, we know a lot about the Nazarenus family by looking at primary sources. Remember, these were sources that were made during the time we're talking about. So at the top, you'll see what's called a certificate of arrival. And this shows how Henry Nazarenus, or Heinrich Nazarenus, his name in German, was actually left Russia, and he came here to the United States in 1913. Now, we can see from his certificate of arrival, if you read, he actually came here through Canada, and he entered the United States through Detroit. And then eventually he made his way all the way here to Windsor. And we can see that by reading the newspaper that was published in Windsor at the time. Have you ever read a newspaper? Well, newspapers were published in the past just like they are today. Now we can see from reading this newspaper that Henry and his family arrived in 1926 on a Tuesday evening, and that they purchased a grocery store. And his son, Henry Jr., was taking care of the grocery store. And by looking at primary sources, we can even tell more about the grocery store. So this is an advertisement about the grocery store. Go ahead and see if you recognize any of the food listed in this advertisement. This all sounds pretty good to me. I see pineapple on here for only 26 cents a can. I see raspberries, I see coffee, I even see Van Camp's pork and beans, which we still buy in grocery stores today. So this primary source of a newspaper article gives us a really good idea of what was being sold in a grocery store. Imagine going back to the 1920s. You could have walked into this market and you could have bought the things on this advertisement. And that's why it's so interesting to think about the past and how people influenced it. Why is it important for a town to have a grocery store? Well, people need to eat food, right? You want sometimes to eat your Van Camp's pork and beans. You want your pineapple or your peaches. So it's very important for a town to have enough grocery stores to support the population of people who live there. So when Henry moved to Windsor and opened his grocery store, it left a big impact on the town. It created another place for people to shop. So that was a pretty cool way that he influenced Windsor. Now let's go ahead and meet another person, another German from Russia who came here to Windsor and really impacted the town. Now his name is Alex Lorenz. And this is Alex in this photo here, standing inside of his business, which was on Main Street in Windsor. Can you guess what his business is? Maybe take a look at the back of the photo. Can you see what's hanging on the wall? It might be a little bit hard to make out, but he's actually standing in a shop that's full of a lot of clothing. Those are jackets hanging up on the back wall. Alex Lorenz was something called a tailor. Now, back before we had shopping malls and we could just go to a mall and buy our clothes or go to a store and buy our clothes, We had tailors, and these were people who were very good at taking care of clothes and making clothes and sewing clothes. And you could go to a tailor and he could clean your clothes for you, he could sew you new clothes, he could iron your clothes, and he could take care of your clothes for you. And Alex Lorenz was a tailor here in Windsor for many, many decades. And we know this, again, by looking at primary sources that we have in the museum. This is an article from Windsor's newspaper in 1917, if you look at the big top article. And it talks about how Alex Lorenz came here at the end of 1916 and he became a tailor. And then he got married and he's been cleaning clothes and pressing clothes and repairing clothes, which is really great in a little town of Windsor. And so we can read from this article that the town was very grateful to have a tailor here in town, and that Alex was very, very busy as a tailor. And he was a tailor here in Windsor for decades. You can see from this lower article, which was actually published in 1981, so decades later, that Alex Lorenz was making leather elbows for coats or sweaters. If you've ever seen a patch on the elbow of a coat or a sweater, he was making those, even though he was very elderly by that time. And you can also see a picture of one of the artifacts we have in our museum, which is a coat made by Alex Lorenz. So that's a really good source that we have to see what kinds of things he was making. So it's pretty cool to think about the impact that Alex Lorenz had on the town of Windsor. Imagine that you didn't have time to make a shirt or you didn't have time to clean your clothes. You could take them into Alex Lorenz. Imagine that you couldn't afford a new shirt. You just had to get a patch for it. You could take it to Alex Lorenz. So it was really important for a town to have a tailor. He knew almost everyone in town and he fixed a lot of different people's clothes. So when he immigrated here to Windsor, that was a really big deal for the town. Let's meet another family. They're pretty cool. This is the Meyer family. Henry Meyer immigrated from Russia to the US in 1913, and later they came to Windsor in the 1920s. Now let's see if we can figure out what kind of store they opened. Can you look at the advertisement on the screen and guess what kind of store Henry ran? I see the word meats. He ran a meat store. And you can see from this advertisement that his meat market sold things like hamburger, beef roast, and steak. So you could go there to get just all the meat that you wanted. And we can also read the newspaper, our primary source, to get other interesting facts about his family. So in this article here that was published in 1926, it talks about how Henry and his wife had their 9th child, and they were very proud of their family. Now that's such a cool fact to have. We know, even though this article was published almost 100 years ago, that Henry and his wife were proud of their family, which is a really cool fact to know. And again, why is it important for a place to have a meat market? Well, it gives us more options to shop, right? If you are looking for a specific kind of meat, you can go there and you can find it. So it's another kind of industry for the town that helps it to grow. Now, what's really cool about Henry is this article here that we have in the newspaper, and it reports on something really cool that he did. You'll see the headline. It says, Henry Meyer installs electric refrigerator in his meat market. Now, do any of you have a refrigerator in your house? I bet that most of us do, right? It's so important to have a refrigerator. It helps us keep our food cold. But before refrigerators were invented, people would have to either can or preserve their food so that it stayed nice, or they had an ice box and would have to haul in blocks of ice for their ice box to keep their food cold. Well, Henry was the very first person in Windsor to install a refrigerator in his store. Now, it's very important to keep meat cold, so he must have put a lot of thought into what he needed for his store. And the newspaper wrote this long article about how it's the first one of its kind in use in a Windsor market. And then it reports on how the machine works. It lowers the temperature, it controls the temperature, and it keeps the shop cool and it keeps the meat cool. So Henry, when he left Russia and he immigrated here to Windsor, made a huge impact on the town. Now, other businesses were able to see what Henry was doing. He figured out how to install this refrigerator in his market, and it sort of set a goal for other people to be doing. So it really influenced Windsor and the town. So again, we can see how one person moving here influenced Windsor. And so overall, just by looking at these couple of families out of the hundreds who moved here to Windsor, we can see how people influence a community. People like Alex Lorenz or Henry Mayer immigrated to Windsor and helped make the sugar beet industry successful. We had hundreds of families who came here, and the whole family would work in the sugar beet fields. The sugar beet industry couldn't have worked without them. And we know that other families moved here to Windsor and opened new stores and created new farms. And we also know that we can visit Windsor today and we can still see some of their homes and some of the buildings that they worked in today. So because of all these people moving here and supporting these industries and creating new industries like a meat market, we know that people have a huge influence. Now, what kind of influence do you have on your community? Where do you like to shop? What do you like to do for fun? All of these things help to influence and change the world around us. Now think, if you went back in time to 1904, what do you think you would want to do in Windsor? Would you want to be a farmer? A shop owner? And how do you think that would influence how Windsor is today? Go ahead and give that some thought. Maybe write down your answer. Talk about it with your parents. I'm really interested to see what you think. But I'm really glad that you guys are able to join me for our virtual field trip today and see some of the photos and objects that we have at the Windsor Museum. If you have any questions, just let your teacher know. And I'm so glad you guys were able to come along on our history adventure today.